Last night I was coming up from the boat on the four-wheeler and it was dark out. The bear was...
They signed up to survive the Alaskan wilderness, the brutal winters, the frozen rivers, the unforgiving land that shows no mercy to anyone. They did it on camera, week after week, for years, and audiences fell in love with every single one of them. But some of those beloved faces are gone now, not because Alaska beat them, but because life did. And the stories behind how they left us are more heartbreaking than anything the show ever aired. The show that made them family. There are reality shows, and then there is Alaska, the last frontier. Most reality television is built on conflict, manufactured drama, and people who are famous for being famous. But this show was different from the very first episode, and audiences felt that difference the moment they saw it. What they were watching was not a performance. It was a life, raw and unfiltered, playing out on one of the most unforgiving pieces of land on the planet. The Kilcher family had been living on that homestead outside of Homer, Alaska, long before any camera crew ever showed up. Their roots in that frozen, breathtaking wilderness stretched back generations, all the way to Kilcher, a Swiss immigrant who carved a life out of nothing in Alaska in the 1940s. He did not just survive out there, he built something that outlasted him, a legacy so deeply rooted in that land that his grandchildren and great-grandchildren are still living it today. That history is what gave the show its soul, and audiences could feel every ounce of it. When the Discovery Channel first aired Alaska, The Last Frontier, back in 2011, nobody quite knew what they had on their hands. The network had a wilderness survival show, yes, but what they actually had was something far more powerful than that. They had a family, a real one with real tensions and real love and real stakes. At's Kilcher, the patriarch, was magnetic in a way that felt completely unintentional, which made it all the more compelling to watch. His son, At's Lee, had that same energy, restless and deeply connected to the land in a way that was almost spiritual. And Otto Kilcher, with his mechanical genius and his enormous laugh, became the kind of television presence that people genuinely looked forward to seeing every single week. But here is what separated this show from everything else on television at the time, and what still separates it now. The danger was never staged. When winter came to that homestead, it came hard and it came fast, and every single person on that property had to be ready for it or suffer the consequences. The animals needed feeding, the firewood needed cutting, the food needed to be stored, and if any one of those things failed, the family felt it immediately and directly. There was no safety net, no production assistant waiting off screen with a warm coffee and a backup plan. What viewers were watching was the real thing, and they responded to that authenticity with a loyalty that most television shows can only dream about. Over the years, the fan base that gathered around this show became something remarkable in its own right. These were not casual viewers who tuned in and forgot about it by Monday morning. These were people who followed the Kilcher family the way you follow people you actually know, people who celebrated the good seasons with them and worried through the hard ones. When a calf was born healthy or a harvest came in strong, fans felt genuine relief. And when things went wrong on that homestead, which they did often and sometimes devastatingly, those same fans felt the weight of it in a way that was deeply personal. That is the thing about loving a show like this one. It does not just entertain you, it pulls you in until the people on your screen start to feel like neighbors, like extended family, like people whose lives are somehow intertwined with your own. And when those people face tragedy, when grief finds its way through the television screen and into your living room, it does not feel like news. It feels like a loss. Real loss. The kind that sits with you. And that is exactly what this story is about. Because the Kilcher family, for all the strength and resilience and sheer stubborn toughness that made them famous, has not been spared from grief. They have buried people they loved. They have sat with loss in the middle of that vast Alaskan wilderness, with no crowd to comfort them and no script to follow. And the fans who loved them have grieved right alongside them, quietly, from thousands of miles away. What follows is the story of those losses, told the way they deserve to be told, with honesty, with care, and with the full weight they have always carried. The first goodbye, Stuart Kilcher.
But being told you have cancer is a scare nonetheless. Yeah, it all started with...
Some losses arrive with warning, giving you just enough time to brace yourself before the impact hits. But others come out of nowhere, sudden and absolute, leaving nothing behind but silence and the slow, aching work of trying to understand what just happened. Stuart Kilcher's death was the second kind. It was the kind of loss that stops a family mid-sentence, the kind that makes everything else feel small and irrelevant by comparison. And for the Kilcher family, it landed like a wound that the Alaskan wilderness itself could not have prepared them for. Stuart Kilcher was not the most visible member of the family on screen, and that is precisely what makes his story so important to tell properly. Television has a way of creating a hierarchy of attention where the loudest voices and the most dramatic moments get the most airtime and quieter, steadier presences get folded into the background. Stuart lived more in that background, but background does not mean unimportant. And anyone who understood the Kilcher family dynamic knew exactly how much he meant to the people closest to him and how deeply his absence would be felt once he was gone. He was the son of Ats Kilcher, which means he grew up inside one of the most storied families in Alaskan television history. Shaped by the same land, the same values, and the same unspoken understanding that life out there demanded everything you had and sometimes took more than you were prepared to give. Growing up, Kilcher was not a quiet or simple thing. It meant inheriting a legacy that was simultaneously beautiful and brutal, a connection to the wilderness that ran so deep it was less a lifestyle and more a bloodline. And Stuart carried that inheritance the way all the Kilcher children did, with a kind of quiet pride that did not need an audience to validate it. What made his passing hit the fan community so hard was precisely that quietness. Because when someone loud and central is lost, the world already has a framework for the grief. There are tributes and headlines and a designated space for the mourning to happen in. But when someone steady and beloved slips away, the grief is somehow more disorienting because the absence is felt before it is fully understood, like a sound you did not realize you were listening to until it stops, and the silence rushes in to fill the space it left behind. The details surrounding Stuart's passing were handled with the kind of privacy that the Kilcher family has always maintained around their most painful moments, because these are people who live their lives with remarkable openness on camera, but have never confused transparency with vulnerability. And they have always known the difference between sharing their story and surrendering their grief to public consumption. What was confirmed was the loss itself, and that confirmation was enough to send shockwaves through a fan base that had spent years feeling connected to every branch of this family tree, near and distant alike. Ats Kilcher, who has never been a man to hide his emotions easily, carried the weight of this loss in the way that fathers carry the losses that were never supposed to happen in the order they happened, with a heaviness that no camera could fully capture and no episode could adequately address, because there are some things that simply exist beyond the reach of television, beyond the reach of storytelling itself, and a father grieving a child is one of them. Full stop. Regardless of how famous the family is or how many people are watching from the outside, for the fans, Stuart's death became one of those quiet turning points in the show's emotional history. The kind of moment that does not make it into highlight reels or anniversary specials, but lives permanently in the memory of anyone who was paying close enough attention when it happened. It was the moment the show stopped being just a story about survival and became something else entirely, a testament to what it actually costs to live the way the Kilchers live. Not just in terms of physical endurance, but in terms of love and the irreversible grief that love always carries inside it like a second shadow. The homestead kept going because that is what homesteads do and that is what this family does, but it kept going with one fewer voice in it, and that silence has never quite been filled. The fall that changed everything. Ats Kilcher.
Ats is miles away hiking, and I get the phone call in the middle of the night that no wife should ever get.
He did not die that day, but he came close enough that the people who loved him are still not entirely over it. In the summer of 2015, Ats Kilcher was doing what he had done his entire life, moving through the Alaskan wilderness like a man who belonged there, like someone the land itself had claimed and raised. And then, in a single unscripted moment, everything changed. He fell off a cliff. Not a stumble, not a near miss that makes for good television. A real fall in a real wilderness, miles from anything resembling help, and the version of Ats that survived that fall was never quite the same man who went over the edge. So here's the question that haunted fans for years afterward. What really happened out there on that mountain? And what did it cost him? Let us go back to the beginning of that story, because it does not start with the fall. It starts with the kind of man Ats was before it happened, and understanding that is the only way to truly understand what was lost, even though he survived. Ats Kilcher grew up as the middle son of Ats Kilcher, which in this family meant he was caught between a legendary father and a wilderness that demanded everything from everyone who dared to call it home. He was restless in a way that felt almost inherited, like the land itself had passed something electric into his bloodstream from birth. He hunted, he fished, he hiked into territory that most people would not approach without serious equipment and a very good reason. He was not reckless, he was experienced. And that distinction matters because What happened to him in 2015 was not the result of carelessness. It was simply Alaska being Alaska.
I didn't really understand what was happening, but so far, what I know is this. Audsley and Mike Shellman were going for a hiking trip across the bay.
The fall happened during a solo hiking trip in the Kachemak Bay Wilderness area near the family homestead. He lost his footing on terrain that would challenge even the most seasoned outdoorsman, and he went down hard, sustaining injuries serious enough that his survival alone was something close to miraculous. The injuries to his back were severe. The recovery that followed was long, painful, and deeply uncertain in its early stages, with no guarantee that he would ever return to the kind of physical life he had always lived. Now here is what the cameras did not fully show and what the fans deserve to know. The aftermath of that fall crept into every corner of his life in ways that went far beyond the physical. Alaskan had always been one of the more emotionally complex figures on the show, someone who wore his inner life a little closer to the surface than the typical rugged Alaskan outdoorsman is supposed to. And the accident peeled back another layer of that complexity in ways that were difficult to watch and impossible to look away from. He spoke carefully and with obvious effort about the psychological weight of surviving something that serious, about the strange guilt and disorientation that comes with being a man defined by physical capability suddenly stripped of it.
But it started to get dark as they were hiking. Audsley was looking for Mike, and then he fell off a cliff.
His wife Jane, who had been one of the show's most beloved figures in her own right, stood beside him through every stage of that recovery with a steadiness that was quietly extraordinary to witness, because she never made it about herself, never turned his pain into a storyline, and never let the cameras see more than he was ready to give. That kind of partnership does not get enough credit in conversations about this family, and it deserves to be named directly. But the recovery, as hard as it was, is not where this story ends. Because what followed the physical healing was something the show was never fully able to contain within its format. Alaskan began pulling back, slowly at first, then more decisively. His appearances on the show became less frequent, his presence on the homestead less central. And eventually, the man who had once been one of the series' most magnetic personalities became someone viewers only glimpsed occasionally, like catching sight of someone through a closing door. He did not disappear, but he stepped back. And for a show built on presence, on the specific, irreplaceable energy of the people who carry it, that step back felt like its own kind of loss, quiet and unannounced, but permanent in a way that the audience felt long before anyone said it out loud. The fall did not kill Alaskan Kilcher, but it changed the shape of everything that came after it, for him, for his family, and for a show that was slowly learning what it meant to keep going when the people at its center were no longer quite who they used to be. The legend steps back. Otto Kilcher and the Weight of Years.
Otto here, out feeding my horses. Got some news that I'd passed away. It's a lie, it's not true.
Picture this. A man the size of a small legend, standing in a field he has worked for decades, laughing that enormous laugh of his while fixing something that probably should have been replaced years ago. That image, more than almost any other, is what people mean when they say Otto Kilcher was the soul of Alaska, the last frontier. Not a soul in a quiet background kind of way. A soul in the loudest, warmest, most impossible to ignore way imaginable. So when that presence began to fade, people noticed. They noticed before anyone said anything official. And the question that started circulating quietly among the show's most devoted fans was one that nobody particularly wanted to ask out loud. Was Otto Kilcher okay? To understand what his stepping back meant, you first have to understand what he brought to the show in the first place. Because Otto Kilcher was never just a cast member. He was an atmosphere. Every scene he appeared in carried a specific energy, part mechanical genius, part force of nature, part genuinely hilarious human being who seemed constitutionally incapable of taking himself too seriously, even when the situation absolutely called for it. He was born into the Kilcher legacy the same way all of them were, shaped by that Alaskan homestead the way rock is shaped by water, slowly and completely until the land and the person become almost indistinguishable from each other. His father, Yule, had built something extraordinary in those frozen acres outside Homer, and Otto inherited not just the land, but the instinct for it. The ability to look at a broken piece of equipment, or a struggling animal, or a failing system, and understand intuitively what it needed and how to give it that. He was, by any reasonable measure, irreplaceable on that homestead. His wife, Charlotte, known to fans simply as Charlotte Kilcher, matched him in almost every way that mattered, bringing her own quiet strength and grounded warmth to a show that could easily have become all muscle and machinery without her. Together, they were one of the most genuinely compelling couples in reality television history. Not because they performed their relationship for the cameras, but because they clearly did not need to, because what existed between them was self-evident and required no staging whatsoever. But here is where the story shifts, and where the question the fans were asking starts to find its answer. Otto's health became a visible concern as the show moved through its later seasons. The physical demands of homestead life are extraordinary under any circumstances, but they compound differently as a person ages. And Otto, for all his seemingly inexhaustible energy, was not immune to that compounding. Viewers began noticing the changes gradually, the way you notice someone aging when you see them every day, versus the shock of it when you have been away for a while. It crept in around the edges at first. Then it became harder to ignore. He has spoken openly about the physical toll that decades of that lifestyle have taken on his body, about the injuries that accumulated over years of working in conditions that would have broken most people long before the cameras ever arrived, and about the reality of managing a body that has given everything it had to a piece of land and a way of life that demanded nothing less than everything. There was no bitterness in the way he talked about it. That is perhaps the most Otto thing about the whole situation. The man has never once sounded sorry for any of it.
And it's pretty sad that there's people out there got nothing better to do than put out silly rumors. So yep, I'm here.
His appearances on the show thinned out in the more recent seasons, and each time he appeared, it carried a slightly different weight than it used to. The weight of someone you are aware you might not be seeing for much longer, someone whose presence you have taken for granted for years, and are only now beginning to properly appreciate because the possibility of its absence has become real in a way it never was before. That shift in how audiences watched him changed the texture of the show permanently, because once you start watching someone with that kind of awareness, you cannot go back to watching them any other way, and every scene becomes something to hold on to rather than simply enjoy. Otto Kilcher is still alive, but the version of him that carried that homestead on his shoulders for over a decade is slowly, quietly, and with enormous dignity passing the weight to younger hands. And that, in its own way, is its own kind of farewell. The ones the cameras never properly mourned. There is a particular kind of grief that television never quite knows how to handle. It is not the grief that comes with a dramatic episode, a tearful confession, or a moment the production team had time to prepare for. It is the grief that arrives between seasons, quietly and without warning. The kind that the show acknowledges briefly in an opening dedication or a single sentence from a cast member staring into the middle distance, and then moves on from because the homestead does not stop and the cameras cannot afford to either. But those losses deserve more than a dedication card. They deserve to be named properly and held for longer than a 30-second tribute allows. So here is the question worth sitting with. Who did this family lose that the world barely noticed? And what did those losses actually do to the people left behind? Kilcher, because every conversation about loss in this family eventually leads back to him anyway. He was the foundation, the original, the Swiss immigrant who arrived in Alaska in 1941 with almost nothing and proceeded to build a homestead, a legacy, and a bloodline that would eventually become one of the most watched families in the history of American reality television. He passed away in 1998, years before the show ever existed, which means most viewers never saw him, never heard his voice, never watched him move through that land he loved with the specific confidence of a man who had earned every inch of it through decades of brutal, beautiful work. But his absence has always been present in the show, woven into every conversation about legacy and land and what it means to carry something forward, because the Kilchers carry Yule with them in everything they do, and understanding that is essential to understanding why every subsequent loss hits the family the way it does, layered on top of an original loss that never fully healed. Then there is the story of Ats Kilcher himself, not his death, because Ats is still alive, but the losses he has carried so publicly and so painfully that they belong in any honest conversation about grief and this family. His struggles with the trauma of his own childhood, the emotional inheritance passed down from a father who was extraordinary in some ways and deeply damaging in others, have been some of the most raw and uncomfortable television this show has ever produced. And they matter here because they reframe what loss means in the context of this family. Loss for the Kilchers is not always a death. Sometimes it is a childhood that was taken. Sometimes it is a version of a parent you needed and never had. Sometimes it is a relationship with a sibling or a child that fractures under the weight of pain that was never properly processed. Ats has spoken about all of these things with a courage that is genuinely uncommon. And each time he did, the audience understood a little more clearly that what they were watching was not just a survival show, but a portrait of a family still in the process of surviving each other. And then there are the animals. This might sound like a strange place to go in a conversation about grief, but anyone who has watched this show with genuine attention knows exactly why it belongs here. The Kilchers have lost livestock, working dogs, and animals that were not just property, but partners in the daily work of keeping that homestead alive. And the show has never been shy about letting the cameras sit with those losses, because the family never treated them as minor. A working dog on a homestead like this one is not a pet in the conventional sense. It is a colleague. And when those animals died, the grief on the family's faces was real, unacted, and completely deserving of the space the show gave it. What all of these losses share, the human ones and the animal ones and the quiet in-between ones that never made it to air, is that they accumulated season after season, year after year, building a weight that the show carried in its bones even on its lightest episodes, even in its funniest moments, even when Otto was laughing and the harvest was good and everything on that homestead looked, just for a moment, like it was going to be fine. It was never just fine. It was always more complicated than that. And the fans who stayed through all of it understood that even when they could not quite articulate why the show felt heavier with every passing season, it felt heavier because grief accumulates. And on a homestead in Alaska, with nowhere to put it and no pause button to press, it accumulates faster than almost anywhere else on Earth. What the homestead looks like now.
About 24 degrees today. It's been below zero for most of the winter. And it's kind of my last chance to get down in the valley and go to one of my most favorite places. Absolutely beautiful.
Here is something nobody tells you about long-running reality television. The show does not just document a family. Over time, it becomes part of the family itself, woven into the rhythms of their life in ways that are almost impossible to separate from the life they would have lived without the cameras. And when that show starts to change, when faces disappear and seasons grow quieter, and the energy shifts in ways that are hard to name but impossible to ignore, it does not just feel like a television show aging. It feels like watching a family age in real time, with no ability to look away. That is exactly where Alaska, the last frontier, stands right now. The homestead outside Homer is still there, the land has not changed. Alaska has not softened or made any concessions to the passage of time, because that is not something Alaska does for anyone, not even for families who have given it generations of their lives and more grief than any single piece of land should reasonably ask for. The mountains are still there. The winters still arrive without apology. The work still demands everything from everyone willing to show up for it. But the people are different now, fewer of them, older, carrying more than they were carrying when this all began in 2011, when the show was new and the family felt somehow invincible in the way that all families feel invincible before life has had enough time to prove otherwise. At's Kilcher is still there, still present, still carrying that complicated emotional weight he has never once tried to hide from the cameras, and that honesty alone is worth something in a television landscape full of people performing versions of themselves that have nothing to do with who they actually are. His son, Ats Lee, moves through life more carefully now, more deliberately, as a man does when his body has taught him a lesson he did not ask for and cannot forget. Otto is still there too, quieter than he used to be, slower in ways that are nobody's fault and everybody's sorrow, but present, which at this point in the story feels like its own form of grace. The show has survived things that would have ended lesser productions entirely. It has survived injury and illness and grief and family fracture, and the relentless, grinding physical reality of trying to document a life that does not pause for production schedules or network notes. That survival is not nothing. It is actually remarkable when you hold it up against everything this family and this show have been through together. But survival and thriving are two different things, and the most honest thing you can say about Alaska, the last frontier in its current form, is that it is doing the former with enormous dignity while quietly mourning the latter. The Kilcher family built something on that homestead that was never supposed to be watched. It was supposed to be lived. And every loss they have absorbed, every goodbye they have had to say in front of cameras or in private, has only made that original truth more visible. They came to survive Alaska, and they have. But the cost of that survival is written all over them now, in the faces of the people still standing, and in the permanent, irreplaceable absence of the ones who are not Alaska. The Last Frontier was never just a show. It was a testimony. A family bleeding, building, losing, and refusing to quit on land that has never once made anything easy for them. The faces that are gone have left marks that no new season can fill. And the ones still standing carry all of it, every loss, every goodbye, every hard winter, right there in plain sight for anyone willing to look closely enough. If this story moved you the way it moved us, leave a comment below and tell us which Kilcher family member meant the most to you. And if you're not subscribed yet, now is the time. More stories like this one are coming. Do not miss them.